Greetings, chroniclers. Ever fancy being an emperor? Try being a Byzantine emperor during the Crusades. You were the inheritor of Rome, a beacon of civilization, suddenly playing host to hordes of uncouth Westerners who were supposedly there to help. It was less a holy alliance and more a multi-generational migraine. The sheer irony is that you might have preferred the quiet life of a peasant over the constant imperial headache. Let's explore why it truly, deeply sucked to wear the purple robes when the help arrived. It's a delightfully dreadful tale of regal misery. To wear the imperial purple of Byzantium in the late 11th century was to be the inheritor of 1,000 years of history, the steward of civilization itself. The Byzantine Empire, in its own eyes and for much of the world, was not merely a successor to Rome. It was Rome. Its capital, Constantinople, was the envy of the world, a city of unimaginable wealth, profound learning, and divine protection. The Hagia Sophia's dome touched the heavens, the libraries held the wisdom of the ancients, and the emperor was God's chosen regent on earth, the pinnacle of a sophisticated, complex, and deeply proud society. But this was the legacy. The immense, crushing weight of this legacy rested upon the shoulders of the emperor, who was expected to uphold this golden image. For centuries, his predecessors had faced down Goths, Huns, Persians, and Arabs. They had codified laws, sponsored breathtaking art, and engaged in labyrinthine diplomacy that kept barbarians at the bay. The very title of emperor came with the expectation of serene superiority and effortless control over a world that looked to Constantinople as its center. The court was a world of intricate ceremony, where every bow and procession reinforced the cosmic order with the emperor at its apex. But by the reign of Alexios, the Komnenos, this magnificent tapestry was fraying, its golden threads worn thin. The glorious past was a ghost that haunted the grim reality of the present. The serene superiority was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked scramble for survival. The empire was not a global power projecting strength, but a beleaguered state bleeding from a dozen wounds. Surrounded by ambitious and ruthless enemies, the Grant inheritance felt less like a gift and more like a curse. To the west, the Norman adventurers, fresh from conquering southern Italy, eyed the wealthy provinces of the Balkans. Their leader, Robert Guiscard, was a man of terrifying ambition who saw the Byzantine throne as the ultimate prize. To the north, across the Danube, the Pechenegs, a nomadic Turkic people, launched devastating raids deep into imperial territory, threatening the very approaches to Constantinople. The emperor was forced to fight on multiple fronts, draining the treasury and manpower that were already in perilously short supply. The most catastrophic blow, however, had come from the east. The Seljuk Turks, in a staggering reversal of fortunes for the empire, had shattered the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. This was no mere border skirmish. It was a disaster that ripped the heart out of the empire. Anatolia, the vast, fertile peninsula that had been the primary source of the empire's soldiers and food for centuries, was now largely lost, overrun by Turkish horsemen. The loss was strategically crippling and psychologically devastating. The emperor, Alexios I, was a brilliant military commander and a shrewd ruler, but he was a man holding back a tidal wave with a crumbling wall. The imperial army was a shadow of its former self, a patchwork force heavily reliant on foreign mercenaries of questionable loyalty. The treasury was empty, the bureaucracy was fractured by internal rivalries, and the sense of divine favor that had sustained the empire for so long was shaken to its core. The situation was desperate, untenable. It was from this position of profound weakness that Alexios looked to the west. His plea to Pope Urban II was not for a holy war, not for a mass migration of nations. The thought would have horrified him. What Alexios envisioned was a manageable contingent of elite, professional mercenaries, the famed Frankish knights. He needed a few thousand skilled, heavily armed soldiers to supplement his own forces, to help him push back the Seljuks and stabilize the eastern frontier. He was, in essence, trying to hire a contractor for a very specific, very dangerous job. He expected disciplined soldiers, not a torrent of humanity. What he got instead was a horrifying, magnificent, and utterly chaotic surprise. He had asked for a scalpel and was handed a landslide. The Pope's call had unleashed the pent-up energy, ambition, and religious fervor of an entire continent. The emperor and his refined, orderly court watched in disbelief as tens of thousands of Westerners began to arrive. They were not just soldiers, but nobles, peasants, priests, women, and children. A disorganized, zealous tide. They were, from the sophisticated Byzantine perspective, uncouth, unwashed, and dangerously unpredictable. They wanted military aid, not a land invasion by what they considered to be, in private, well-meaning barbarians. The emperor's dilemma was now a full-blown nightmare. To understand the cataclysmic misunderstanding that became the First Crusade, we must first step into the throne room of Emperor Alexios I, Komnenos. This was not the seat of a confident ruler of the world, but the command center of an empire on the brink of collapse. The Seljuk Turks had devoured Anatolia, the empire's heartland, and their raiding parties could practically see the walls of Constantinople. Alexios, a man of immense cunning and pragmatism, was playing a desperate game of survival. His native armies were shattered, his treasury was bare, and his borders were under assault from all sides. He needed soldiers, but not just any soldiers. The Byzantine military had a long and storied tradition of employing foreign mercenaries, from the legendary Varangian Guard composed of Norsemen and Anglo-Saxons to Norman knights serving in Italy. The empire was accustomed to hiring foreign steel to fight its battles. These mercenaries were professional, they were paid, and most importantly, they were under the emperor's direct command. They followed imperial orders, fought for imperial objectives, and when the campaign was over, they were paid and dismissed. This was the model Alexios had in mind. In March of 1095, his envoys stood before Pope Urban II at the Council of Piacenza in Italy. Their speech was carefully crafted. They spoke of the suffering of the Eastern Christians under Turkish rule, a detail calculated to appeal to the Pope's sense of duty. They described the relentless advance of the infidels towards Constantinople itself, painting a picture of a sister church in mortal peril. This was all true, but it was presented with a specific goal in mind. The core of Alexios's request was purely military and secular. He was making a formal appeal for military aid, specifically for contingents of the heavily armed and formidable Western knights he had both fought against and hired before. He needed a few thousand of these elite warriors to bolster his own armies. His plan was straightforward: integrate these Western professionals into his command structure and use them to spearhead a campaign to recapture vital Anatolian cities like Nicaea. He was, in essence, putting out a call for skilled sword-wielding employees. He was not asking for a holy war. He was not asking for the liberation of Jerusalem, a city that had been out of Byzantine hands for over 4 centuries. The idea of a mass, religiously motivated migration of armed pilgrims was a concept utterly alien to the calculated, cynical world of Byzantine statecraft. Alexios saw the problem as a strategic one, requiring a military solution, not a spiritual crusade. He wanted a manageable force, not a movement. He asked for a few hired swords. He got a stampede of zealots. Pope Urban II heard the desperate plea from the East, but he saw in it an opportunity of world historical proportions. Alexios's request was merely the spark, the raw material that Urban, a brilliant political and spiritual leader, would forge into something far grander and far more to his own purposes. The Pope had his own agenda, one that transcended the immediate needs of the Byzantine Emperor. Urban saw a European continent tearing itself apart. Knights and nobles were engaged in endless bloody private wars, and the peace and truce of God movements had limited success in curbing this violence. The Crusade offered a perfect outlet for these aggressive energies. He could redirect the martial passions of the Frankish nobility outwards, towards a common, righteous enemy. Instead of fighting each other, they could fight for Christ. Furthermore, the papacy was in the midst of a power struggle with the Holy Roman Emperors of Germany, known as the Investiture Controversy. By launching a grand international expedition under his own authority, Urban could dramatically elevate the prestige and power of the papacy, positioning himself as the undisputed leader of Christendom, capable of mobilizing armies and nations in a way no king or emperor could. It was also a chance to assert papal supremacy over the Eastern Orthodox Church. While the plea for help was framed as aiding a sister church, successfully rescuing the East and, more importantly, recapturing Jerusalem would place the Roman pontiff in a position of immense authority over the ancient patriarchates of Antioch and Jerusalem, and even Constantinople itself. It was an opportunity to heal the Great Schism of 1054, but on his terms. So in November 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II delivered one of the most effective and consequential speeches in history. He took Alexios's desperate practical request for soldiers and transformed it into an impassioned spiritual call to arms. He spoke not just of helping the Byzantians, but of the defilement of the Holy Land. He painted vivid, horrifying pictures of atrocities committed against pilgrims and the desecration of holy sites. This was the masterstroke. The objective was no longer merely reinforcing the Byzantine frontier. The new ultimate goal was the liberation of Christ's own tomb in Jerusalem. This was a goal that could galvanize the soul of Europe in a way that retaking Nicaea for the emperor never could. He offered a full remission of sins for those who took up the cross, a spiritual reward of unimaginable value. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Cries of "Deus Volt" erupted from the crowd. Alexios had wanted a few regiments, Urban had unleashed a human avalanche. The Pope's call spread like wildfire, carried by preachers across Europe. It resonated not just with the high nobility Urban had targeted, but with every level of society. Knights, yes, but also peasants, artisans, and the poor, all seized upon the idea of this armed pilgrimage. The promise of salvation, adventure, and plunder was an irresistible combination. The first sign to Alexios that his plan had gone horribly, disastrously wrong was the arrival of the so-called People's Crusade. This was not the disciplined army of knights he had anticipated. It was a chaotic, disorganized, and starving mob, led by charismatic figures like Peter the Hermit and Walter Saint-Savoie. They had no great noble leaders, no proper supply lines, and very little military discipline. They swept across the Balkans towards Constantinople, leaving a trail of pillage and destruction in their wake as they foraged for food. They clashed with local Byzantine officials and garrisons who were shocked by their unruly behavior and sheer numbers. For the emperor, who prized order and decorum above all else, this was his worst nightmare made real. These were not the elite mercenaries he had requested. They were a horde of fanatics who were proving to be as much of a threat as the Turks. When this first wave finally reached Constantinople, Alexios was appalled. They were ill-equipped and ill-disciplined, a danger to the city itself. Anxious to get them away from his capital and across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor, he hastily ferried them over. He warned them to wait for the main armies of the princes to arrive, but their zeal and impatience were too great. They promptly marched against the Turks and were ambushed and utterly annihilated. This disaster was a grim foreshadowing of the immense challenge to come. The People's Crusade was just the prelude. Soon after, the real armies of the First Crusade began to arrive. Massive forces led by the great princes of Western Europe, Godfrey of Bouillon, Bohemond of Taranto, Raymond of Toulouse. They were powerful, proud, and ambitious men, not hired subordinates. Alexios' desperate plea for help had succeeded beyond his wildest dreams, and it had become the single greatest threat to his empire. The headache had just begun. After the calamitous overture of the People's Crusade, Emperor Alexios might have hoped the main event would be more orderly. He was catastrophically wrong. Starting in the autumn of 1096, the real armies of the First Crusade began to arrive, not as a unified force, but in waves, each led by a powerful and fiercely independent Western prince. The first major contingent was led by Hugh of Vermandois, brother of the French king. He arrived not as a humble pilgrim, but with an arrogant message demanding a lavish reception, a preview of the difficult personalities Alexios would have to manage. Soon after, the formidable host of Godfrey of Bouillon, Duke of Lower Lorraine, appeared. This was not a small band of mercenaries, it was a vast army, complete with cavalry, infantry, and a long train of non-combatants. They descended on the lands surrounding Constantinople, and with them came trouble. The Byzantines had prepared markets to sell the Crusaders' supplies, but the Westerners, accustomed to foraging and plunder, often simply took what they wanted. Skirmishes broke out between the locals and the pilgrims, and the countryside began to suffer. The view from the magnificent walls of Constantinople was one of growing horror for Alexios and his subjects. The fields and villages outside the capital, the very breadbasket for the Queen of Cities, were now occupied by tens of thousands of armed foreigners who did not share their language, their customs, or their concept of discipline. The emperor's daughter, the historian Anna Komnenos, would later write with disdain about their greed, their volatility, and their perceived lack of sophistication. To the refined Byzantines, it was as if a tribe of barbarians had set up camp on their doorstep. Alexios' primary objective was to control this volatile situation. He needed to extract a promise from these powerful warlords before he would grant them passage across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. His demand was simple in theory, but immensely complex in practice. Each leader had to swear an oath of fealty to him. They had to promise to return any formerly Byzantine lands they reconquered from the Turks to the authority of the emperor. This was the entire point of the exercise for Alexios. He was not funding an expedition for them to carve out new kingdoms for themselves. This demand was met with immediate resistance. The Crusader lords were proud, ambitious men. They saw themselves as soldiers of Christ, not as employees of the Byzantine Emperor. They had endured a long and arduous journey to fight for God, and they were not inclined to subordinate themselves to a ruler they viewed as effeminate, treacherous, and most damningly, a schismatic Greek. The negotiations were a masterclass in tension and mutual suspicion. Godfrey of Bouillon initially refused the oath, leading to a tense standoff. His troops began to plunder the suburbs of Constantinople more aggressively, and Alexios in turn cut off their supplies. For a terrifying moment, it seemed a full-scale battle between the Crusaders and the imperial army might erupt just outside the capital's walls. Only after a delicate mix of threats, diplomacy, and the promise of lavish gifts did Godfrey finally relent and take a mod of. Alexios had won the first round, but the cost was high. Then came Bohemond of Taranto. For Alexios, this was the most dangerous arrival of all. Bohemond was the son of Robert Guiscard, the Norman adventurer who had spent his life trying to conquer Byzantine territory in the Balkans. Alexios knew him personally, had fought against him, and understood the depth of his cunning and ambition. He knew Bohemond was not here purely for piety. He was here for power and territory. Watching him arrive was like welcoming a viper into your home. Yet Alexios handled Bohemond with political genius. Instead of treating him with overt hostility, he showered him with charm and flattery. He received Bohemond in private, treating him not as a subordinate but as an equal, reminding him of their past conflicts as if they were old warriors sharing stories. He lavished him with treasure, showing him rooms filled with gold and jewels. Bohemond, ever the opportunist, took the oath eagerly, likely seeing it as a small price to pay for imperial support and a stepping stone to his true goal, seizing the great city of Antioch for himself. Next to arrive was the massive southern French army under Raymond IV of Toulouse. Raymond was the oldest, wealthiest, and most pious of the senior leaders, and also the most stubborn. He had a genuine religious zeal, but also an immense pride. He flatly refused to swear the same oath as the others, considering it beneath his dignity to become the vassal of another monarch. He argued that he had taken the cross to serve God alone. The stalemate with Raymond was perilous. His army was one of the largest, and his intransigence threatened to unravel the fragile agreements Alexios had secured from the others. Again, the emperor had to deploy his entire arsenal of statecraft. He met with Raymond repeatedly, applying pressure, offering compromises, and highlighting the dangers of a divided command. In the end, a compromise was found. Raymond agreed to a modified oath, swearing not to harm the emperor's life or honor. It wasn't the full submission Alexios wanted, but it was enough to keep the enterprise moving. Imagine the sheer stress on the emperor. He was essentially juggling grenades. His capital city was surrounded by unpredictable foreign armies who were draining his resources and terrorizing his people. He had to act as a gracious host, a stern negotiator, a generous benefactor, and a threatening military power all at once. Every day brought fresh reports of skirmishes, demands for more food and money, and the ever-present risk that one of these volatile armies might turn on Constantinople itself. The cultural gap was a chasm. The Crusaders were loud, boisterous, and direct. The Byzantine court was built on subtle intrigue, ceremony, and indirection. The Westerners saw the Byzantines as deceitful and effeminate. The Byzantines saw the Westerners as crude, oafish, and dangerously violent. Anna Komnenos famously complained about a Frankish knight who, bored during a court ceremony, brazenly sat on the emperor's throne. This single act symbolized the entire problem, a profound lack of respect for the ancient and sacred order of the Roman Empire. Beating these armies was a logistical nightmare. Alexios had to organize a constant stream of provisions, carefully controlling the supply to keep the Crusaders dependent on his goodwill. He assigned imperial troops to escort the Crusader contingents, both as a guide and as a police force, trying to minimize the plundering and friction as they marched from their camps to the Bosphorus crossing. The entire operation was a drain on the imperial treasury and a massive administrative headache. Finally, after months of exhausting negotiations, tense standoffs, and ruinously expensive bribery, Alexios succeeded. One by one, he managed to get the main armies across the straits and into Asia. He had their oaths, however reluctantly they were given. He had, for the moment, channeled the destructive flood away from his capital and pointed it towards the enemy. It was a stunning diplomatic achievement, born of immense patience and cunning. But as he watched the last of their ships sail towards the Asian shore, the emperor could not have felt entirely relieved. He had invited a distant, rowdy cousin to dinner, and that cousin had brought 50,000 friends who had tracked mud all over the palace, insulted his family, and nearly burned the house down. Now they were in his backyard, redecorating with axes. He had managed them for now, but he knew this was not the end of his troubles. It was merely the end of the beginning. The fate of his empire now rested on the swords of men he could not command and barely trusted. For Emperor Alexios, the oath of fealty was everything. It was the legal and diplomatic cornerstone upon which this entire, terrifying enterprise was built. In the highly formalized world of Byzantine statecraft, an oath sworn by a prince was a sacred, binding contract. It transformed the Crusaders from a dangerous mob into a legitimate, if temporary, extension of the imperial army. This oath was the sole mechanism by which Alexios could ensure that the blood and treasure he expended on these Westerners would result in the recovery of his lost lands, not the creation of new, hostile rival states on his border. The terms were, from the Byzantine perspective, perfectly logical. Any city, fortress, or territory that had belonged to the empire before the Turkish invasions and was recaptured by the Crusaders must be returned to the authority of an imperial representative. In return, the emperor would provide supplies, logistical support, a contingent of Byzantine troops, and his royal guidance. It was a straightforward quid pro quo. Alexios provides the means, the Crusaders provide the muscle, the empire gets its territory back. However, the emperor and his court failed to grasp a fundamental reality of the West. While feudal oaths were common, they were also commonly broken. For the fiercely independent and ambitious princes of the Crusade, an oath given to a distant Greek-speaking monarch they neither liked nor trusted, especially when given under duress, was a matter of temporary convenience. They were warriors of Christ on a divine mission, and in their minds, this sacred duty would ultimately trump any political promise made to a schismatic emperor. The process of extracting these oaths was a masterclass in imperial pressure. Alexios dealt with each leader individually, preventing them from forming a united bloc against him. He controlled their access to Constantinople, their daily bread, and their passage to Asia. He was the gatekeeper, and the toll was their submission. A leader who refused the oath, like Godfrey of Bouillon did initially, found his food markets closed and his army facing starvation, with the disciplined imperial army watching from the city walls. It was a simple choice: swear the oath, or risk the failure of your entire expedition before it even began. This was not a negotiation between equals, it was a political strong-arming. The leaders were essentially guests in the emperor's domain, and he used his home field advantage to its absolute maximum. Lavish gifts and feigned friendship were balanced with the implicit threat of annihilation. The Crusader princes were trapped. They had marched their armies 1,000 miles and could not turn back. They needed the emperor's help. So one by one, they swallowed their pride, knelt, and swore their fealty. It was a promise made with a sword at their back. The problem with a promise made under duress is that it lacked moral weight. It created immediate and lasting resentment. The Western leaders felt they had been manipulated and humiliated by the treacherous Greek. They saw the oath not as a sacred bond, but as a shameful concession. This seeded a deep-seated distrust that would poison the entire relationship. From the very beginning, the alliance was built not on mutual respect, but on a coerced and resented contract. It was like asking a pack of hungry wolves to sign a vegetarian pledge. They might sign it to get into the pasture, but no one should be surprised when they revert to their nature. The very first test of this fragile agreement came at the Siege of Nicaea in 1097, the first major city to be tackled. The Crusaders, fighting with ferocity, besieged the city for weeks, taking heavy casualties. They were on the verge of storming the walls, anticipating the immense plunder that was their customary reward for a successful siege. This was their moment of victory, earned with their own blood. But Alexios, ever the strategist, had been negotiating behind their backs. His general, Manuel Bautamites, arranged a secret surrender with the Turkish garrison. One morning, the Crusaders awoke to see the emperor's standards flying from the city walls. Nicaea had yielded not to them, but to Alexios. While this was technically in perfect accordance with the oath, the city was returned to Byzantine control. The Crusaders were furious. They had been denied their loot and their glory. They felt cheated, believing the emperor had stolen their hard-won prize. The first crack in the alliance had appeared. Despite this initial friction, the joint operation continued its crawl across the desolate Anatolian plain. The Crusaders won a major victory at Dorylaeum, where Byzantine guides proved useful, and for a time it seemed the partnership might work. The Crusaders were the tip of the spear, and Alexios provided the strategic oversight and logistical tail, but the farther they marched from Constantinople, the weaker the emperor's influence became, and the more independent the Crusader leaders grew. The ultimate breaking point, the moment the oath was shattered beyond repair, came at the great city of Antioch. This ancient patriarchal see was the grand prize of northern Syria. For the Crusaders, it was a vital strategic objective. For one Crusader in particular, the cunning and ambitious Bohemond of Taranto, it was the fulfillment of his destiny. He had no intention of conquering this metropolis for Alexios, he wanted it for himself. The siege of Antioch was a long, brutal, and nightmarish affair that lasted for nearly 8 months. The Crusaders suffered from starvation, disease, and constant attacks from Turkish relief forces. Throughout this ordeal, they looked west, hoping for the arrival of the main Byzantine army led by the emperor himself, As they believed he had promised, Alexios had indeed marched out, but he received panicked reports, exaggerated by other Crusader deserters, that the situation at Antioch was hopeless and a massive Turkish army was approaching. Fearing the loss of his own army for a lost cause, he made the fateful decision to turn back. For the Crusaders starving outside Antioch, Alexios' failure to appear was the ultimate betrayal. They had held up their end of the bargain, fighting and dying to capture a former imperial city. In their eyes, the emperor, by failing to provide the promised aid, had been the first to break the oath. This gave them the perfect excuse, the moral justification they needed to void the contract entirely. The emperor had abandoned them, so they were released from their obligations to him. When a stroke of luck and treachery finally delivered the city into their hands, Bohemond made his move. Against the protests of other leaders like Raymond of Toulouse, who still argued the city should be returned to the emperor, Bohemond seized control. He ran his own banner up the flagpole. He argued that the emperor's betrayal had nullified the oath, and therefore he was entitled to claim the city as his own principality of Antioch. He had played the long game and won. His act was a declaration of independence. It was the moment the Crusade ceased to be a Byzantine recovery operation and became a colonial enterprise for the Western lords. The carefully constructed legal framework of the oath, which Alexios had expended so much political capital to build, had crumbled into dust. The wolves had not just entered the pasture, they had claimed it as their own and dared the shepherd to do anything about it. The fallout was immediate and permanent. The relationship between the Crusaders and the Byzantines was now irrevocably broken, replaced by open hostility. When the Crusaders finally, miraculously, took Jerusalem, they did so for themselves, establishing a Latin kingdom with no deference to the emperor. Alexios now had a new problem, a string of aggressive, hostile Crusader states established on land that he considered rightfully his. His desperate plea for help had not only failed to restore his empire, but had created a new front in his multi-front war. He had traded a Turkish threat for a Frankish one. For the rest of his reign and for his successors, dealing with the ungrateful, oath-breaking Crusaders in Syria and Palestine would become a chronic, debilitating imperial headache. The futile exercise of the oath had proven to be one of the costliest political miscalculations in Byzantine history. Of all the imperial cities in the east, Antioch held a special significance. It was one of the ancient jewels of the Roman Empire, a cradle of Christianity, and a city of immense strategic and commercial importance. For Emperor Alexios, its recovery was second only to Nicaea in importance. For the Crusaders, after a hellish march across Anatolia, the city's towering walls represented the single greatest obstacle between them and Jerusalem. It was here, during the grueling siege of 1097 and 1098, that the fragile alliance between East and West would be put to the ultimate test and shatter completely. The siege was an 8-month nightmare. The massive Crusader army, unable to fully encircle the vast city, was itself besieged by hunger, disease, and the constant threat of Turkish relief forces. The once mighty host dwindled as desertions became common. Men starved, horses perished, and morale plummeted. Throughout this agonizing ordeal, the Crusaders clung to one desperate hope, that Emperor Alexios, as promised in their oaths, would march to their aid, with the main Byzantine army and the supplies they so desperately needed. In their minds, the agreement was clear. They were the vanguard, softening up the enemy, and the emperor would arrive as the powerful reinforcing army to secure the final victory. This belief was the only thing sustaining them through the miserable winter. They were fulfilling their part of the oath, bleeding and dying in the mud outside a city that was, by their own sworn word, destined to be returned to the Byzantine Empire. They expected Alexios to fulfill his. Meanwhile, Alexios was indeed on the move. He was methodically reconquering the western coast of Asia Minor, securing his rear and consolidating the gains made possible by the Crusader advance. He was acting as a responsible emperor, not risking his main field army, the last true army of the Roman Empire, on a single, incredibly risky gamble. His plan was to link up with the Crusaders once he had secured his own territory and could advance with a safe line of communication back to Constantinople. The fatal turning point came from a Crusader, not the emperor. Stephen of Blois, one of the senior leaders of the Crusade, deserted the siege, convinced that the cause was utterly lost. Fleeing back across Anatolia, he ran into Alexios' advancing army at Philomelion. He gave the emperor a catastrophic report. The Crusader army was on the verge of annihilation. A massive Turkish force was about to crush them, and the entire expedition had failed. From Alexios' perspective, this was credible intelligence from a high-ranking source. To continue his advance now would be suicidal. It would mean marching his only army into what he was told was a guaranteed massacre, leaving Constantinople and the entire empire defenseless. He made the only logical choice available to a prudent ruler. He listened to the Crusader lord's report, and turned back. He would preserve his army to defend the heart of the empire, believing the Antioch campaign was already lost. Back at Antioch, the remaining Crusaders, unaware of Stephen's desertion, held on. Then, through a stroke of luck and treachery, they found a way in. The Norman Prince Bohemond of Taranto, ever the opportunist, had been secretly negotiating with a disgruntled Armenian tower captain named Firuz. Firuz agreed to betray the city, but only to Bohemond. This was the moment Bohemond had been waiting for. He now played his master hand. He went before the other desperate and starving princes and made his pitch. He revealed his secret contact, but attached a condition. He would only spring the trap and give them the city if they agreed that he, Bohemond, should be its ruler. He argued that since the emperor had failed to appear and had abandoned them to their fate, Alexios had broken the oath first. Therefore, their obligation to return the city was null and void. This was a brilliant, cynical piece of political maneuvering. It preyed on the Crusaders' deep-seated resentment of the emperor and their desperation to end the horrific siege. He presented himself as their savior, and the price of that salvation was the city itself. The argument that Alexios had betrayed them was the legal and moral loophole he needed to justify his own ambition. So much for brotherly love among Christians. This was a hostile takeover. Not all the leaders agreed. The noble and pious Raymond of Toulouse was outraged. He argued vehemently that their oath to the emperor was sacred and must be honored. Handing the city to Bohemond would be a flagrant violation of their sworn word. He represented the conscience of the Crusade, the faction that still believed in the original purpose of the alliance. A bitter and angry debate erupted amongst the leaders, even as their soldiers starved outside the walls. But Bohemond's argument, fueled by desperation, won the day. The majority of the princes, seeing no other option and caring little for the distant Greek emperor who had seemingly left them for dead, agreed to his terms. The trap was sprung. Bohemond's troops scaled Firuz's tower, opened a gate, and the Crusaders poured into the sleeping city, unleashing a torrent of slaughter and plunder. Antioch had fallen. When the dust settled, Bohemond, true to his word, raised his own Norman banner over the citadel. He was now the Prince of Antioch. He had used the crusade to achieve the very thing his father had failed to do, carve out a Norman kingdom in the east. He had exploited the Crusaders' suffering and their anger at Alexios to seize one of the great cities of Christendom for himself. The Byzantine fury upon hearing the news was immeasurable. From their perspective, they had been utterly betrayed. They had funded, supplied, and guided this expedition, only to watch the key prize stolen by a treacherous Norman adventurer. Alexios had turned back based on panicked intelligence provided by a Crusader leader, only to be accused of betrayal himself. It was a maddeningly circular argument in which the Byzantines were blamed for the consequences of the Crusaders' own weakness and disloyalty. This act single-handedly destroyed any remaining trust. The oath of fealty was now a laughable farce. The First Crusade, which Alexios had hoped would be an instrument for imperial restoration, had now permanently installed a hostile, ambitious Latin state on his doorstep. Bohemond's new principality would be a thorn in the side of the Byzantine Empire for generations, a source of constant conflict and a drain on precious military resources. The emperor's worst fears had been realized. His call for a few hired swords had led to this, his lands being carved up by the very men who had sworn to protect them. The allies had proven to be little more than sanctimonious thieves, wrapping their greed in the banner of the cross. For the Byzantine emperor, it sucked to be him because he was forced to watch, powerless, as the glorious prize of Antioch was stolen in an act of breathtaking treachery. For the Byzantine emperor, the arrival of the Crusades wasn't just a political crisis, it was a logistical cataclysm of unprecedented scale. We often focus on the battles and the betrayals, but for Alexios I, one of the most immediate and gut-wrenching challenges was far more mundane, yet infinitely complex. Food. He had invited a handful of guests for a campaign, and a starving city had shown up at his door. The Crusaders were not a modern, self-sufficient army with their own supply corps. They were a migrating nation, and they arrived in the emperor's territory hungry. This was not a trivial matter of setting out a few extra plates. We are talking about tens of thousands of people. The initial People's Crusade was a disorganized rabble, but even the subsequent princely armies were enormous. Estimates vary, but the total number of Westerners who flooded into the Balkans might have exceeded 60,000 people. This included knights, foot soldiers, priests, servants, wives, children, and countless other pilgrims and camp followers. All of them needed to eat every single day. Imagine the sheer organizational challenge. A city the size of medieval Paris or London had essentially materialized on the emperor's front lawn. and it was his responsibility to prevent it from starving, or perhaps worse, from violently feeding itself at the expense of his subjects. They didn't just ask for directions to the Holy Land, they needed 3 meals a day for thousands in your backyard. The strain this placed on the Byzantine state, already weakened by decades of warfare, was immense. To his credit, Alexios anticipated this problem and tried to manage it with classic Byzantine organization. His solution was not to simply hand out free food, which would have been impossible and fiscally ruinous. Instead, he ordered the creation of specially supervised markets at designated locations along the Crusaders' route of march, particularly in the sprawling camps they established outside the walls of Constantinople itself. The idea was to create a controlled, stable environment for commerce. Imperial agents would gather vast quantities of grain, wine, meat, and other foodstuffs from the surrounding provinces and bring them to these markets to be sold to the Crusaders at what were intended to be fair prices. This was meant to be a win-win. The Crusaders would get the supplies they needed without resorting to violence, and the Empire could recoup some of the massive costs. Of course, the reality was far messier. The sheer demand often outstripped the supply Alexios could muster. Gathering provisions on this scale was a monumental task that put a heavy burden on the Byzantine farmers and merchants in Thrace and the Balkans. They were now expected to support not only the massive capital of Constantinople, but also a ravenous foreign army. This inevitably led to local shortages and price inflation, causing deep resentment among the emperor's own people. Furthermore, the Crusaders were not always patient or honest customers. Clashes at the markets were frequent, arguments over prices, accusations of cheating, and simple cultural misunderstandings often boiled over into violence. Knights accustomed to taking what they wanted through force were not inclined to haggle peacefully with a Greek merchant they already viewed with suspicion. For the Byzantines, these allies often behaved more like an occupying army than guests. The most significant problem was that the official markets were never enough. The vast, sprawling Crusader camps were often disorderly, and many of the poorer pilgrims or less disciplined soldiers simply bypassed the markets altogether. They turned to the timeless practice of armies on the move, foraging, which is a polite word for plundering. They raided local farms, stripped orchards, slaughtered livestock, and emptied granaries, leaving a trail of devastation and angering the local populace. This created an impossible dilemma for Emperor Alexios. He was caught between his duty to his own subjects and the necessity of placating his dangerous allies. If he failed to provide enough food through official channels, the Crusaders would pillage his lands, harming his people and potentially sparking a full-blown conflict. If he commandeered too much food from his provinces to satisfy the Westerners, his own people would suffer and resent him for it. It was a no-win situation, a constant, grinding battle. The imperial army, therefore, had to take on a secondary role. It was not just a fighting force, but a massive police escort. Byzantine detachments were assigned to shadow the Crusader armies as they marched. Their job was twofold: to guide the Westerners along the designated routes and, more importantly, to try and prevent them from straying off the path to sack Byzantine towns and villages. It was the deeply humiliating job of protecting the empire from its own friends. The logistical burden did not end at the gates of Constantinople. Once Alexios had finally wrangled the oaths from the Crusader leaders, he faced the immense task of transporting them, their horses, and their equipment across the Bosphorus into Asia Minor. This required the full mobilization of the Byzantine navy and merchant marine, a hugely expensive and complex operation involving hundreds of vessel crossings over many weeks. Once in Asia, the problem of supply became even more acute. The landscape of Anatolia had been ravaged by years of Turkish raids. It was a desolate, dangerous land with few friendly cities and scarce resources. Here, the Crusaders were almost entirely dependent on Byzantine support. Alexios had to arrange for supply drops by sea at various coastal points and ensure his guides knew the few paths where water and some forage could be found. Even the horses were a logistical nightmare. A knight's warhorse was his most valuable military asset, and the Crusaders had brought thousands of them. These animals needed enormous quantities of fodder and water, resources that were incredibly scarce in the arid Anatolian interior. Alexios had to organize shipments of feed and even shiploads of replacement horses, a further drain on the imperial treasury. This entire undertaking was ruinously expensive. The emperor was forced to levy special taxes and even melt down church silver to meet the costs. While he tried to recoup some of it through the markets, there is no doubt that the passage of the First Crusade was a massive net loss for the Byzantine treasury. It was the price Alexios had to pay to point this human weapon away from his own capital and towards the enemy. The resentment this generated cannot be overstated. The common Byzantine citizen, struggling to get by, now saw their food being diverted to feed what they considered to be arrogant, uncouth, and violent barbarians. They saw their emperor spending a fortune to placate these Latins, who in turn treated them with contempt. The title of this chapter, "The Emperor as Quartermaster, Feeding the Locusts," is harsh, but it likely reflects how many Byzantines felt. Their emperor had become the chief caretaker for a swarm that consumed everything in its path, and they were the ones paying the price. For the Byzantine Emperor, the Crusades opened up a painful second front, one fought not with swords and spears, but with doctrine, authority, and simmering religious resentment. The conflict was with the papacy in Rome. To understand this tension, we must remember that the Christian world was already broken. The Great Schism of 1054 had formalized a split between the Western Catholic Church, led by the Pope, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, of which the Byzantine Emperor was the sworn protector. They were two branches of the same faith, but they were also profound rivals. The core of the dispute was a clash of two fundamentally different worldviews. In the West, the papacy had been steadily building its power, claiming that the Pope in Rome held supreme authority over all of Christendom, including kings and emperors. The Pope saw himself as the universal head of the Church. In the Byzantine East, they practiced what is often called Caesaropapism. The emperor was seen as God's chosen regent on earth, a sacred figure who acted as the guardian of the Orthodox faith. He worked in symphony or symphonia with the Patriarch of Constantinople. They did not recognize the Pope's claim to universal jurisdiction. When Emperor Alexios sent his desperate plea for military aid to Pope Urban II, he was approaching a rival, not a subordinate. It was a pragmatic move born of desperation, but he likely hoped it could also begin a process of reconciliation, with Byzantium, the older and more prestigious civilization, taking the senior role. He saw it as one Christian leader asking another for help against a common foe. He gravely underestimated the Pope's own ambitions. Pope Urban II saw the request as a golden opportunity not just to fight the Turks, but to prove the doctrine of papal supremacy in the most spectacular way imaginable. By launching and leading a massive international holy war, he could demonstrate that the papacy, and not the emperors or kings, was the true head of Christian society. He could mobilize the entire continent in a way the Byzantine Emperor clearly could not. The Crusade, from its very inception in the West, was as much a political project to enhance papal power as it was a religious pilgrimage. This put the Byzantine Emperor in an impossible position. He was the Holy Roman Emperor, the inheritor of Constantine the Great, yet here was the Bishop of Rome acting like the commander-in-chief of Christendom. The Crusade was his idea, born of his need, yet it was the Pope's name that was on everyone's lips. The rallying cry was, "God wills it," as interpreted by the Pope in Rome, not the Emperor in Constantinople. It was a subtle but profound usurpation of his own religious and political authority. To ensure Roman control over the expedition, Pope Urban appointed a personal representative, a papal legate, to accompany the armies. This man was Adhemar, the Bishop of Le Puy. Adhemar was a respected and pious figure, and he often acted as a moderating influence on the bickering Crusader princes. He was in many ways the spiritual leader of the entire crusade, but he was first and foremost the Pope's man. Adhemar's presence created a parallel command structure that completely bypassed the emperor. While the Crusader lords had sworn oaths of fealty to Alexios, their spiritual allegiance was to Adhemar, and through him to Pope Urban. When disputes arose, they looked to the papal legate for guidance, not to the Byzantine emperor. This constantly undermined Alexios' authority and reinforced the idea that this was a papal enterprise, merely passing through imperial lands. It's hard to be holy emperor when your supposed spiritual boss is actively trying to undermine you. The Byzantine court watched this with growing alarm. They saw the crusade not as an act of brotherly assistance, but as a vehicle for Roman ambition. Every action taken by the Pope and his legate seemed designed to assert Western Catholic authority over the traditional domains of the Eastern Orthodox Church. The Byzantines saw this as religious imperialism dressed up in the language of a holy war. The ultimate proof of these fears came with the capture of Antioch. This was one of the ancient patriarchates, a cornerstone of the Orthodox world. According to the oath sworn to Alexios, the city should have been returned to the empire, and its Greek Orthodox patriarch should have been restored. But that is not what happened. Instead, after Bohemond seized the city for himself, a Latin patriarch, loyal to the Pope in Rome, was installed. The legitimate Greek patriarch was effectively exiled. This was a direct ecclesiastical assault, a hostile takeover of a major Christian center. The Crusaders were not just conquering land from the Turks, they were conquering churches from the Orthodox. This was an act of pure papal aggression in the eyes of Constantinople. The same story was repeated with even greater significance after the Crusaders captured Jerusalem. The Holy City was of course sacred to all Christians, but for the Byzantines it was a foundational city of their faith. After its conquest, the Crusaders once again ignored the rights of the local Orthodox clergy and established a Latin Patriarchate of Jerusalem, again completely loyal to Rome. They were systematically replacing the ancient Orthodox hierarchy with a new Catholic one. This was the devastating consequence of asking the Pope for help. The emperor had hoped to recover lost territory, but he was now watching as the religious fabric of that territory was being fundamentally and forcibly altered. The Crusade was creating a Catholic colonial church in lands the Byzantines considered their own spiritual heartland. The schism wasn't being healed, it was being carved deeper with the sword. For the emperor, this was an infuriating and humiliating development. He was caught in a pincer movement. On one side, he had the unruly Crusader armies who plundered his lands and broke their oaths. On the other, he had a resurgent, ambitious papacy, using the crusade as a tool to impose its authority and supplant the Orthodox Church. Both groups were his supposed allies against the Turks, but they often felt like a greater threat. The emperor could not openly fight the papacy on this. He still needed the military muscle of the Westerners, and to alienate the Pope completely would be to lose all hope of controlling them. He had to swallow his fury and engage in careful diplomacy, protesting the installation of Latin patriarchs but powerless to reverse it. He was forced to watch as his own church was marginalized in its ancestral home. The long-term damage to Orthodox Catholic relations was catastrophic. The memory of the First Crusade in the East was not one of heroic Christian cooperation. It was a memory of arrogance, betrayal, and religious colonization. The Pope's power play had succeeded in the short term, but it created a well of bitterness and mistrust that would poison East-West relations for centuries to come. This religious dimension is crucial to understanding why it truly sucked to be a Byzantine emperor during this period. The threat was not just military or political, it was existential. The very soul of his empire, its Orthodox faith and its unique position as the true Rome, was being challenged not just by Muslim enemies, but by the very Christian brothers he had summoned to his aid. He was losing a spiritual war on his own territory, a war he never even wanted to fight. Decades after the chaos of the First Crusade, the bitter memories in Constantinople had not faded. The Principality of Antioch remained a hostile Norman state on the empire's flank, a constant reminder of broken oaths. So when news arrived that the Crusader county of Edessa had fallen to the brilliant Turkish Atabeg Zangi, the reaction in the imperial palace was not one of immediate panic, but of weary, cynical dread. They knew what was coming next. The West would preach a new crusade, and the whole nightmare was about to begin again. This time, the emperor on the golden throne was Manuel Apis Komnenos, the grandson of Alexios. He was a charismatic, chivalrous, and pro-Western emperor by Byzantine standards, but he was also a pragmatist who had inherited his grandfather's deep-seated distrust of the crusading movement. He knew the immense cost and the political poison that came with these Western armies. He braced himself for the inevitable deluge. The Second Crusade, when it formed, was even more intimidating than the first. It was not led by bickering princes, but by the two most powerful monarchs of Western Europe, King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany. Each commanded a massive, well-equipped army. For Manuel, this was a terrifying prospect. The arrival of one unruly Crusader army had been a nightmare. The arrival of two, led by kings, threatened to be an apocalypse. The potential for them to unite and attack Constantinople itself was a very real fear. The first to arrive, in the summer of 1147, were the Germans under Conrad III, and they immediately confirmed Manuel's worst fears. They were a disorganized and poorly disciplined force that carved a path of destruction through the Balkans. They plundered Byzantine towns, fought with local imperial troops, and treated the emperor's lands as hostile territory to be foraged at will. Flash floods, which the Germans blamed on Byzantine treachery rather than nature, further soured relations and led to bloody skirmishes. By the time Conrad's army reached the outskirts of Constantinople, they were viewed not as allies but as a hostile invasion force. Tensions were so high that a full-scale battle nearly broke out between the Germans and the imperial army guarding the capital. Emperor Manuel, in a near panic, used his fleet to hastily ferry the Germans across the Bosphorus as quickly as possible, desperate to get this volatile and destructive army out of his immediate vicinity and into Asia Minor, where they could become the Seljuks problem. Next came the French under Louis VII. While better disciplined than the Germans, their arrival still presented a massive challenge. The French leadership, particularly the influential Bishop of Langres, was deeply suspicious of the Byzantines. They had heard the exaggerated tales of Byzantine betrayal from the First Crusade, and arrived with a massive chip on their shoulder. Some of them openly advocated for joining forces with the King of Sicily, the empire's primary western enemy, and conquering Constantinople first before heading to the Holy Land. Once again, the Byzantine Emperor was forced into the role of a stressed-out host, managing deeply unwelcome guests. Manuel had to employ the entire Komnenian playbook, a delicate mix of lavish ceremony, flattering diplomacy, carefully managed markets, and the constant, watchful presence of his army. He had to cajole, guide, and police the French across his territory, all while knowing that a significant portion of their army viewed him as an enemy and a heretic. Having shipped both armies into Asia Minor, Manuel gave them sound advice rooted in a century of experience fighting the Turks. Stick to the coastline where the Byzantine fleet could supply them and the territory was secure. It was the slow, safe route. Conrad III, arrogant and eager for glory, completely ignored this counsel. He chose to march his army directly into the arid heart of the Anatolian plateau, taking the same perilous route that had nearly destroyed the First Crusade. The result was a predictable and unmitigated disaster. At the Second Battle of Dorylaeum, not far from where the First Crusaders had won a great victory, Conrad's overconfident and dehydrated army marched straight into a Seljuk ambush. The Turkish horse archers decimated the Germans. The great army was shattered, with Conrad himself among the wounded. The survivors limped back to Nicaea in utter humiliation, a shadow of the mighty force that had arrogantly ignored the emperor's warning. The French army, under Louis VII, following a different path but also ignoring much of the Byzantine advice, fared little better. At Mount Cadmus in 1148, the French vanguard marched too far ahead of the main army and its baggage train. Seeing the column disconnected and vulnerable, the waiting Seljuks attacked. They swarmed the exposed French infantry and pilgrims, inflicting devastating casualties. Louis VII only survived by scrambling up a rock and fighting off his attackers alone. His army was mauled, demoralized, and had lost most of its supplies. The Second Crusade was, in military terms, a complete and utter failure. The two great kings of Europe had led their mighty armies into Anatolia, only to see them annihilated due to their own poor discipline, arrogance, and refusal to heed the advice of their more experienced Byzantine allies. They eventually made it to the Holy Land as little more than glorified pilgrims, where their ill-conceived siege of Damascus also failed spectacularly. Now came the inevitable, poisonous fallout. It was unthinkable for the great kings and nobles of the West to accept that the failure was their own fault. Their pride and prestige were at stake. They needed a scapegoat, and the perfect candidate was the treacherous Greek emperor in Constantinople. A narrative began to form almost immediately. They had not failed, they had been betrayed. The Crusaders accused Manuel of deliberately misleading their armies, of providing them with poor guides who led them into ambushes. This flew in the face of the fact that they had explicitly ignored the primary guidance to stick to the coast. They claimed the Byzantine markets had sold them tainted food, poisoning their troops. It was a litany of bitter, self-serving excuses designed to shift the blame for their own incompetence onto the Byzantines. The most damaging accusation was that Manuel had made a secret truce with the Seljuk Sultan and was actively colluding with the enemy. A truce did exist. For the pragmatic Manuel, it made no sense to fight a two-front war against the Turks and the Crusaders simultaneously. It was a standard Byzantine foreign policy move to keep one enemy quiet while dealing with another. But for the Crusaders, this was the ultimate proof of treachery. A Christian emperor making peace with the infidel while God's own armies were on the march? It was unforgivable. And so, the legacy of the Second Crusade was not just one of military failure, but of cementing a deep and lasting hatred. The Westerners returned home with stories of Byzantine betrayal, poisoning the well of public opinion for generations. The Byzantines, for their part, were utterly exasperated. They had endured another round of chaos, spent a fortune, suffered the plundering of their lands, and been forced to manage another wave of arrogant, unruly allies. They came, they saw, they failed spectacularly, and then blamed us for it. For the emperor, it was a thankless, infuriating, and deeply damaging ordeal that proved once again just how much it sucked to be him. As if dealing with hordes of unruly crusaders, a hostile papacy, and treacherous Norman princes wasn't enough, the Byzantine emperor had to contend with a danger that was far more intimate and often far more deadly: his own court. The shining golden image of the imperial throne masks a dark and bloody reality. In Byzantium, power was a savage game, and the rules were written in poison and steel. The Crusaders were a recurring external migraine, but the threat of internal revolt was a chronic, incurable disease. The Roman concept of a clear hereditary succession had never fully solidified in its Eastern continuation. While dynasties did exist, there was a persistent underlying principle that the throne belonged to the most competent man, or more accurately, the man most capable of seizing it. An emperor who was perceived as weak, incompetent, or militarily unsuccessful was seen as having lost divine favor. This made him a legitimate target. Every powerful general, every influential court official, and every ambitious member of the extended imperial family was a potential rival. To wear the imperial purple was to live in a state of constant, gnawing paranoia. Every flagon of wine had to be checked for poison. Every shadow in the palace corridors could conceal an assassin. The emperor had to scrutinize the ambitions of his own generals, fearing that a victorious commander might become popular enough to march on the capital and claim the throne for himself. A military defeat could be just as dangerous, proving to the world that you were unworthy of rule. Even the imperial family, the people who should have been the emperor's staunchest allies, were often his most dangerous enemies. The Komnenian dynasty, which presided over the First and Second Crusades, was itself rife with internal conspiracy. After the death of the great Alexios I, his brilliant daughter, the historian Anna Komnenia, launched a plot to assassinate her own brother, the legitimate heir John II Komnenos, and place her husband on the throne. The plot failed, but it's a stark reminder that in Constantinople, not even your own sister was above trying to kill you for power. Your biggest threat wasn't always outside the walls. Sometimes it was your own sibling with a sharp knife and a power complex. This internal fragility was a constant distraction. While an emperor was trying to manage the immense logistical and political challenge of a passing crusade, he also had to dedicate enormous energy and resources to espionage within his own court. He had to balance factions, buy loyalty with lavish gifts and titles, and ruthlessly neutralize any perceived threat. A moment of inattention, a misplaced trust, could be fatal. The external pressure from the Crusaders only exacerbated this internal tension, creating opportunities for rivals to criticize the emperor's handling of the Latins and foment dissent. One of the most terrifying tools in the Byzantine political arsenal was blinding. By imperial tradition, the emperor had to be physically perfect, free from any mutilation. This led to a uniquely cruel political solution. Instead of outright executing a defeated rival or a troublesome relative, an act that could lead to martyrdom and blood feuds, the victor would often have them blinded. A pair of hot irons or a skillfully wielded blade could permanently disqualify a man from the throne without the sin of regicide. It was a fate many considered worse than death, condemned to a life of darkness and political impotence. The history of the crusading era is punctuated by emperors who seized power through violence. Alexios I himself had taken the throne in a coup, but the most spectacular and horrifying example of this internal volatility is the story of Andronikos I Komnenos, who came to power in the chaotic period just before the Third Crusade. His reign is a chilling testament to the brutality of Byzantine politics. Andronikos was a cousin of the Emperor Manuel I. He was a man of immense charm, intelligence, and ruthless ambition. After Manuel's death, with the empire under the unpopular regency of the Empress Dowager, Andronikos saw his chance. He postured as a man of the people, a reformer who would sweep away the corrupt elite. He marched on Constantinople and was welcomed by the city mob, who proceeded to massacre the Western Latins residing in the city, a grim foreshadowing of future events. Once in power, Andronikos revealed his true nature. He first became co-emperor to the young heir Alexios II, posing as his protector. Shortly after, he had the boy strangled with a bowstring and allegedly ordered the body to be decapitated. He then married the boy's 11-year-old child widow to legitimize his reign. He had reached the throne over the corpse of his own young relative. His rule became a reign of terror. He launched a brutal purge of the aristocracy, targeting any family he saw as a threat. The very elites who had resented the previous emperors now found themselves being tortured, blinded, and executed by a paranoid tyrant. Andronikos believed that only through sheer terror could he secure his precarious hold on power. He trusted no one, and for good reason. He knew exactly how he had gotten there. The lesson of Andronikos is critical. The internal political system of Byzantium was capable of producing monsters. While emperors like Alexios I and Manuel V were sophisticated statesmen trying to navigate the Crusader crisis, the throne could at any moment fall into the hands of a paranoid butcher like Andronikos. The systems of checks and balances were often simply whoever had the sharpest sword or the most ruthless disposition. Andronikos' own end was as brutal as his reign. His terror eventually provoked a popular uprising when a nobleman named Isaac Angelos, marked for death, fought back against Andronikos' agents and fled to the Hagia Sophia for sanctuary. The city mob rallied to his side and proclaimed him emperor. Andronikos was captured while trying to flee. The mob then subjected him to several days of horrifying torture. He was paraded through the streets, his hair and teeth were pulled out, his right hand was cut off, and one of his eyes was gouged out. Finally, he was hung by his feet between two pillars, and stabbed and mutilated by the very people who had once hailed him as their savior. He died a slow, agonizing death. This was the man who sat on the throne of Constantine just a few years before the Fourth Crusade. His successor, Isaac Angelos, who took power amid this chaos, would himself be overthrown and blinded by his own brother, who then became Alexios III. It was this weak, dysfunctional, and debt-ridden government of feuding, backstabbing brothers that the Fourth Crusade would eventually encounter. So when we picture the Byzantine Emperor during the Crusades, we must banish any image of serene, untroubled power. We must see a man standing on a crumbling precipice. In front of him was the roaring sea of the Crusades, unpredictable, demanding, and dangerous. But behind him, on the cliff edge itself, were his own family, his own generals, and his own people, holding daggers and waiting for him to show the slightest sign of weakness. The external pressure of the Crusades didn't create the instability of the Byzantine throne, it simply poured fuel on a fire that had been burning for centuries. Of all the various groups of Westerners who descended upon the Byzantine Empire under the banner of the cross, none were viewed with more justified suspicion and outright hostility than the Normans of southern Italy. For the emperor in Constantinople, the arrival of the Norman contingent was not the arrival of a new ally. It was the return of an old, rapacious, and terrifyingly effective enemy. This wasn't a case of meeting a new, rowdy friend. It was like opening your door to find your most persistent and dangerous rival standing there, wearing a new hat and claiming he was now on your side. Long before Pope Urban II ever preached the First Crusade, the Byzantines and the Normans had been locked in a bitter struggle for control of Italy. The Normans, descendants of Vikings who had settled in France, were a force of nature in the 11th century. They were ambitious, militaristic, and incredibly skilled warriors. They had systematically conquered the Byzantine provinces in southern Italy, a region known as the Catapanate of Italy, extinguishing the last vestiges of Roman rule in the west. This was a direct, unprovoked seizure of imperial land. The architect of this conquest was the formidable Robert Guiscard, a man of legendary cunning and ambition. But he didn't stop with Italy. In 1081, he launched a full-scale invasion of the Byzantine Balkans, his eyes set on the ultimate prize, the imperial throne in Constantinople itself. At his side during this invasion was his equally ambitious and formidable son, Bohemond of Taranto. Emperors Alexios, Komnenos, early in his reign, had personally fought against these men. At the disastrous Battle of Dyrrhachium, Alexios' army was shattered by the Norman charge. He had witnessed their military prowess and their ruthless aggression firsthand. He spent years fighting a desperate war to expel them from his lands. So when, a decade and a half later, Bohemond of Taranto showed up at the gates of Constantinople as a leader of the First Crusade, Alexios knew exactly who he was dealing with. Oh, look, our old nemesis, just with a fancier hat and a very flimsy excuse to invade. For Alexios, Bohemond's claim of religious piety was a transparently thin veil for his true ambitions. He knew that a man who had dedicated his youth to conquering the empire would not suddenly become its loyal servant simply because he had sewn a cross onto his tunic. He saw Bohemond not as a pilgrim but as an opportunist of the highest order, using the crusade as a vehicle to achieve by other means what he and his father had failed to achieve through direct invasion, the establishment of a powerful Norman kingdom in the east. This pre-existing animosity framed every single interaction. When Alexios demanded the oath of fealty from the Crusader leaders, his gaze must have been most intense when it fell upon Bohemond. He knew this oath was essential, a desperate attempt to legally bind a man he knew to be treacherous. Bohemond, for his part, played the role perfectly. He was charming, agreeable, and swore the oath with a theatrical flourish, all while undoubtedly planning exactly how and when he was going to break it. Throughout the initial stages of the crusade, Bohemond proved to be one of the most effective military commanders. He was brilliant, daring, and a natural leader of men. But his every action was calculated to serve his own ends. His ultimate goal was the great city of Antioch. It was rich, strategic, and far enough from Constantinople to be defensible against an imperial counterattack. It was the perfect capital for a new Norman principality. As we've seen, Bohemond's seizure of Antioch was a masterpiece of cynical manipulation. He used the emperor's failure to appear with a relief army, a failure precipitated by a fellow crusader's panicked report, as the legal pretext to void his oath. He skillfully outmaneuvered the other crusade leaders and claimed the ultimate prize for himself. For Alexios, this was not just a betrayal. It was the inevitable fulfillment of Bohemon's true character. The fox had gotten into the henhouse and was now claiming ownership. The establishment of the Norman Principality of Antioch created a permanent geopolitical nightmare for the Byzantine Empire. It was a dagger pointed at the heart of their Anatolian territories. Instead of a restored imperial province, Alexios now had a hostile, aggressive Norman state on his border, ruled by his old archenemy. For the next several decades, Byzantine foreign policy would be consumed with trying to contain, undermine, and conquer this rogue Crusader state. But the conflict did not end there. After establishing his rule in Antioch, Bohemond faced increasing pressure from Byzantine forces. In a stroke of audacious genius, he left his nephew Tancred in charge of Antioch and returned to Europe. But he did not go home to retire. He went home to gather a new army, and this time he dropped all pretense of fighting for a holy cause in the East. Bohemond began preaching his own new crusade. He toured France and Italy, displaying relics and telling harrowing and likely fabricated tales of Byzantine treachery. He portrayed Emperor Alexios as a villain, a heretic, and the true enemy of the crusading movement. His message was simple and direct. The real obstacle to securing the Holy Land was the perfidious Greek Empire. The target of his new crusade was not the Turks, it was the Christians of Constantinople. In 1107, Bohemond landed his new army in the same place his father had landed his nearly 30 years earlier, the Byzantine coast of modern-day Albania. His intention was to march on Constantinople and finish the job his father had started. The mask was off. The crusading banner was now being used as an instrument for a blatant war of aggression against the largest and wealthiest Christian empire on earth. This time, however, Alexios was ready. He was no longer the young, inexperienced emperor who had been defeated at Dyrrhachium. He was a seasoned, cunning veteran who knew his enemy inside and out. He trapped Bohemond's army, cutting off its supplies by sea and containing it on land. He refused to give Bohemond the pitched battle he wanted. Instead, he subjected the Norman army to a slow, grinding siege, letting disease and starvation do their work. Finally, humiliated and defeated, Bohemond was forced to surrender. He was compelled to sign the Treaty of Devol in 1108. In this treaty, Bohemond had to reaffirm his oath of fealty, acknowledge himself as the emperor's vassal, and agree to the restoration of a Greek patriarch in Antioch. It was a total political victory for Alexios, but a humiliating end for Bohemond, who died shortly after in Italy, a broken man. While Bohemond himself was defeated, the problem he created lived on. The Norman Principality of Antioch would continue to be a source of conflict for generations. The story of Bohemond perfectly encapsulates why it sucked to be the Byzantine Emperor. You had to contend with your oldest and most bitter enemies, who now arrived disguised as holy pilgrims, used your resources to achieve their own selfish ambitions, and then turned the very ideal of crusading into a weapon against you. It was a cynical, exhausting, and dangerous game. After a century of mutual resentment, betrayals, and simmering hatred, we arrive at the final, catastrophic punchline. This is the story of the Fourth Crusade, the moment when the crusading movement dropped all pretense of piety and revealed itself to the Byzantines for what it had become, a greedy, cynical, and lethally dangerous force of destruction. All the paranoia, all the fear, all the distrust the emperors had harbored for 100 years would be proven horrifically correct. The ultimate betrayal was at hand. The crusade began, as they often did, with a call from a powerful pope, Innocent III, and an official target, Egypt, the heart of Saracen power. The plan was ambitious and required a massive fleet to transport the army by sea. The leaders of the crusade contracted the maritime superpower of Venice to build this fleet. They agreed to a staggering price of 85,000 silver marks. It was a fatal miscalculation. When the Crusader army assembled in Venice in 1202, only a fraction of the expected number of soldiers had shown up. They could not possibly pay their bill. The Crusaders were trapped. They were thousands of miles from home, deeply in debt, and entirely at the mercy of their Venetian creditors. The leader of Venice was the Doge, Enrico Dandolo. He was an old man, said to be over 90 and blind, but his mind was as sharp and ruthless as a shard of glass. He saw the Crusaders' predicament not as a problem, but as a golden opportunity to advance Venetian interests. He made them a proposal they couldn't refuse. Dandolo suggested that if the Crusaders would help the Venetians recapture the rebellious city of Zara on the Dalmatian coast, he would agree to defer their debt. There was just one small problem. Zara was a Christian city under the protection of the King of Hungary, who had himself taken the cross. Many of the Crusaders were horrified. They had signed up to fight infidels, not to attack fellow Christians for the commercial benefit of Venice, but they were desperate. With heavy hearts, they agreed. The Crusade's first act was to besiege and sack a Christian city. an act for which the Pope promptly excommunicated the entire army. It was at this point, with the crusade already morally bankrupt and in disarray, that a new figure appeared with a fateful proposition. He was a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, son of the deposed and blinded Emperor Isaac II Angelos. His uncle, Alexios III, had usurped the throne. The young Alexios promised the Crusaders that if they diverted their army to Constantinople and placed him and his father back on the throne, he would solve all their problems. His offer was the stuff of fantasy. He promised to pay off their entire debt to the Venetians. He promised to give them an additional 200,000 silver marks. He promised to provide them with provisions for their entire army, to join the crusade to Egypt himself with 10,000 Byzantine soldiers, and, the ultimate prize for the Pope, to submit the entire Eastern Orthodox Church to the authority of Rome. It was an impossibly tempting offer. He was essentially offering them the entire Byzantine treasury and its soul. For the desperate Crusaders, this was a divine godsend, a way to salvage their expedition and get rich in the process. They agreed. The Fourth Crusade, already diverted from its original mission, now set its sights not on the shores of Egypt, but on the mighty walls of Constantinople. The largest Christian city in the world was about to be attacked by the very army that was supposed to be its shield. In 1203, the massive Venetian fleet, with the Crusader army on board, appeared before the Theodosian walls. The reigning emperor, Alexios III, was a weak and incompetent ruler. After a brief siege, he panicked, gathered as much treasure as he could, and fled the city. The Crusaders had won. They entered the city, freed the blind Isaac II from his dungeon, and crowned his son alongside him as co-emperor Alexios IV. The deal seemed to have paid off. But the young Alexios IV had made a promise he could never hope to keep. The imperial treasury had been plundered by his fleeing uncle. The empire was nearly bankrupt. He tried to raise the money by imposing crippling new taxes and even melting down priceless holy icons, acts which made him hated by his own people. The citizens of Constantinople, who already detested the Latins, grew openly hostile as the Crusaders camped outside their walls, demanding the payment that never came. The situation was untenable. The relationship between the citizens and the Crusaders exploded into open violence. A fire, started during a brawl, swept through the city, destroying a huge portion of it and leaving thousands homeless. The city was on the edge of revolt. Alexios IV, caught between his furious people and his impatient, powerful allies, was helpless. In early 1204, a palace coup took place. A fiercely anti-Latin nobleman known as Alexios Doukas, nicknamed Mourtzouphlos for his bushy eyebrows, seized power. He had the young Alexios IV strangled in his cell and announced to the Crusaders that no payment would be forthcoming. He became Emperor Alexios V, and his first act was to man the walls and prepare for the inevitable assault. For the Crusaders, this was the final straw. They felt they had been betrayed by the Greeks once again. In their minds, the Byzantines were treacherous, heretical, and had murdered their rightful lord. The Venetians, for their part, simply saw the greatest commercial prize in the world ripe for the taking. They drew up a formal treaty, the Partitio Romaniae, to divide the spoils of the Byzantine Empire amongst themselves before they had even conquered it. In April 1204, the final assault began. After 3 days of brutal fighting, the Venetian ships managed to storm the weaker sea walls. The defenders' morale collapsed, Alexios V fled, and the Crusader army poured into the city. What followed was one of the most shameful and horrific events in Christian history: the Great Sack of Constantinople. For 3 days, the soldiers of Christ ran riot in the city they were supposed to protect. They engaged in an orgy of looting, vandalism, and slaughter. They murdered thousands of civilians without mercy. They desecrated the most sacred spaces, including the great cathedral of Hagia Sophia itself. They placed a prostitute on the patriarch's throne, drank wine from the holy chalices, and hacked priceless altarpieces to pieces for their gold and silver. So much for brotherly love among Christians. They looted with a savage intensity. Palaces and private homes were stripped bare. But the greatest tragedy was the destruction of art and knowledge. Statues of bronze and marble that had survived for 1,000 years were melted down for coin. Libraries full of ancient manuscripts were put to the torch. Relics from countless saints were stolen and shipped back to churches in the West. It was a cultural catastrophe from which the world has never recovered. The Byzantine Empire, which had stood for over 1,000 years as the bastion of Christendom in the East, was shattered. The Crusaders and Venetians carved up its territory, establishing a weak, short-lived Latin empire with a Flemish knight, Baldwin of Flanders, as its first emperor. The dream of Alexios I, Manuel I, and all the other emperors had turned into the ultimate nightmare. They came to save the Holy Land, but ended up looting our holy city. Close enough, I guess? For the inheritor of Rome, there could be no greater, more final, or more bitter reason why it truly sucked to be a Byzantine emperor during the Crusades. After the smoke from the fires cleared and the screams in the streets fell silent, the conquerors of Constantinople had to figure out what to do with their broken prize. The 3 days of horrific sacking had shattered the soul of the city, but now came the political butchery. The leaders of the Fourth Crusade and the Venetian Doge Enrico Dandolo set about carving up the carcass of the Roman Empire according to their pre-conquest agreement, the Partitio. What they created was not a restoration or a new beginning, but a hollow, pathetic mockery of what had come before, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. First, they needed an emperor. After some political maneuvering, the great lords of the Crusade elected Baldwin of Flanders, a pious and respected nobleman, as the first Latin emperor. He was crowned in the desecrated Hagia Sophia, a Flamen in the throne of Constantine, a feudal king ruling over the ruins of a complex, bureaucratic, and ancient civilization. It was a jarring and unnatural fit. Baldwin and his successors would wear the imperial purple, but they were merely pale imitations, foreign landlords presiding over a hostile and resentful population. The empire they inherited was a ghost of its former self. The Partitio Romaniae had seen to that. The treaty systematically dismantled the centralized Byzantine state. Venice, as its reward for masterminding the whole affair, claimed the lion's share, taking 3/8 of the territory. This included the most valuable ports, strategic islands like Crete and Corfu, and key coastal strips. They were the real winners, establishing a maritime trading empire that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. The Crusade had been the greatest and most profitable corporate takeover in Venetian history. The rest of the empire was handed out to the Crusader lords. The kingdom of Thessalonica was given to Boniface of Montferrat, the original leader of the Crusade. Other French, German, and Italian knights became dukes, counts, and barons, establishing feudal fiefdoms across Greece and Thrace. The complex 1,000-year-old administrative structure of the Byzantine Empire was replaced overnight with a patchwork of Western European feudalism, a system completely alien to the local population and traditions. But the Byzantines were not all dead or conquered. The sack of 1204 had decapitated the empire, but its body still twitched with life. In the unconquered territories, Byzantine aristocrats and generals established successor states. In western Anatolia, the Empire of Nicaea was formed, becoming the true government in exile and the heart of the resistance. In western Greece, the despotate of Epirus emerged as another center of Byzantine power. And on the far coast of the Black Sea, the Empire of Trebizond continued on. The fight for the Roman inheritance was far from over. Back in Constantinople, the Latin Empire was a disaster from its very inception. It was chronically unstable, perpetually short on cash, and militarily feeble. The city itself, which once held 500,000 people, became a depopulated shell. Its sophisticated economy had collapsed, its trade routes now diverted to Venice. The grand palaces fell into disrepair, their lead roofs stripped and sold to raise money. Grass grew in the forums where emperors had once celebrated triumphs. The cultural destruction did not end with the sack. The Latin emperors, constantly broke, continued to sell off the city's remaining treasures. Priceless relics and works of art that had been spared in the initial chaos were crated up and shipped west to pay for mercenaries or to curry favor with the Pope. The new Catholic clergy who had taken over the city's churches showed little respect for the centuries of Orthodox heritage they now controlled. It was a slow, agonizing liquidation of a civilization. The Latin emperors were emperors in name only. They had little real authority outside the crumbling walls of Constantinople. Their supposed vassals in Greece often acted as independent rulers, and they were surrounded on all sides by enemies. They were in a near-constant state of warfare, with the powerful Bulgarian Empire to the north and the resurgent Byzantine successor states, particularly the Empire of Nicaea, to the east. The irony was staggering. The Crusaders had justified their diversion by claiming the Byzantine Empire was weak and ineffective, yet the state they created in its place was infinitely weaker and more pathetic. The strong, if flawed, Christian bastion that had shielded Europe from Eastern invasions for centuries was gone. In its place stood a flimsy, bankrupt puppet state that could barely defend itself. It was a strategic catastrophe born of pure greed. The first Latin emperor, Baldwin I, had a reign that was brutal, short, and humiliating. Less than a year after his coronation, he was defeated and captured by the Bulgarian Tsar Kalyan at the Battle of Adrianople. He died a prisoner in a Bulgarian dungeon. His successors fared little better, presiding over an ever-shrinking territory in a city falling deeper into ruin. They were reduced to begging for aid from the Pope and the kings of Europe, who sent little more than thoughts and prayers. The Byzantines in Nicaea, meanwhile, were patiently rebuilding their strength. Led by a series of capable rulers, they consolidated their power, reorganized their army, and engaged in careful diplomacy, waiting for the perfect moment to reclaim their capital. They were the keepers of the true imperial flame, and they watched as the Latin mockery of their empire slowly rotted from the inside out. The whole sad affair was a testament to the Crusaders' spectacular short-sightedness. They had destroyed the very thing they were, in theory, supposed to be helping. They had fractured the Christian East, making it far more vulnerable to future invasions. The damage they inflicted on Constantinople was so profound that even when the Byzantines eventually retook it, the empire would never truly recover its former strength. Finally, in 1261, the inevitable happened. A Nicaean general, Alexios Strategopoulos, found the city of Constantinople almost completely unguarded. The Latin emperor and the Venetian fleet were away on a campaign. In a daring move, his small force slipped into the city by night. The Latin Empire, born in a storm of violence, collapsed with a pathetic whimper. The Byzantine Emperor, Michael VIII Palaeologus, made his triumphal entry into the city his ancestors had lost 57 years earlier. But the city he reclaimed was a shadow of its former glory. Its population was decimated, its buildings were in ruins, and its treasury was empty. The empire was restored, but it was a wounded, fragile thing. The vibrant heart of Eastern Christendom had been deliberately stopped in 1204, and while it had been revived, it would suffer from the consequences for the rest of its existence. Thanks for the help, guys. You really stuck it to us. The ultimate legacy of the Crusades for the Byzantines was a mortal wound, inflicted not by a sworn enemy, but by their own Christian brothers. When we think of emperors, we often picture figures of absolute power, commanding vast armies and shaping the destinies of nations with a mere nod. But for the Byzantine empires during the Crusades, this image couldn't be further from the truth. Their reality was a constant, frustrating tightrope walk, a desperate juggling act of diplomacy, defense, and damage control, all while their once mighty empire slowly, inexorably, crumbled around them. They weren't glorious leaders, they were more like exasperated homeowners watching a slow-motion disaster unfold, largely at the hands of those they hoped would help. Imagine trying to manage a series of escalating crises with a constant stream of allies who were often more interested in plunder than partnership. The Byzantines, inheritors of the Roman Empire's eastern half, had already weathered centuries of invasions from the east. They were masters of complex diplomacy, bribery, and strategic defense. But the arrival of the Crusader armies from Western Europe introduced a new, utterly baffling, and ultimately devastating variable into their meticulously crafted geopolitical equations. These holy warriors often behaved less like disciplined soldiers and more like unruly mobs. The emperors found themselves in an impossible bind. They needed Western military aid to fend off the Seljuk Turks, who had seized much of Anatolia, the Byzantine heartland. Yet inviting these Western armies was akin to inviting a pack of wolves into your sheepfold. The Crusaders frequently looted Byzantine towns, ignored treaties, and even saw the wealth of Constantinople as a tempting prize. The emperor's pleas for strategic cooperation often fell on deaf ears, met with a mix of religious fervor, cultural ignorance, and sheer avarice. One of the most profound frustrations for the Byzantine emperors was the sheer ideological chasm between East and West. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true inheritors of Rome, the defenders of Orthodox Christianity, and the custodians of ancient learning. The Western Crusaders, on the other hand, often viewed the Byzantines with suspicion, seeing them as effeminate, decadent, and even heretical. This mutual distrust was a breeding ground for misunderstanding and betrayal, making genuine, lasting alliances nearly impossible. The First Crusade, initially promising, quickly descended into chaos for the Byzantines. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos tried to exert control, secure oaths of fealty, and direct the Crusaders' efforts towards recapturing lost Byzantine territory. But the Crusaders often went their own way, establishing independent Crusader states that became new, troublesome neighbors rather than loyal allies. This set a dangerous precedent for future Crusades, each bringing new waves of help that often felt more like an invasion. By the Fourth Crusade, the situation reached its tragicomic nadir. What began as a crusade ostensibly aimed at Egypt was infamously diverted to Constantinople itself. Venetian merchants, eager for commercial dominance, manipulated the Crusaders, leading to the unthinkable, the sack of the greatest Christian city in the world by fellow Christians in 1204. The Byzantine Empire was shattered, its treasures plundered, and its lands carved up, a wound from which it never truly recovered. Emperors who reigned during this period were not incompetent. They were often highly intelligent, strategically astute individuals facing unprecedented challenges. They tried everything: diplomacy, bribes, military alliances, even arranged marriages, yet they were ultimately undone by forces largely beyond their control: the insatiable land hunger of the Turks, the volatile nature of Western feudal armies, and the widening schism between the Latin and Orthodox churches. Their reign was a masterclass in trying to manage the unmanageable. So as we reflect on the plight of the Byzantine emperors during the Crusades, it's clear their experience was far from glorious. It was a prolonged, agonizing exercise in futility, a slow, tragic sunset for a once magnificent empire. They were forever trying to explain basic geopolitics to men who thought the sea would part, dealing with allies who were anything but. May your own alliances be less infuriating, and your helpers genuinely helpful, because their reign, that truly hilariously, tragically sucked. Thanks for listening tonight, and may your dreams be free from unruly armies and very bad decisions.